When I walked into the funeral home that morning, the atmosphere crystallized into something sharp and brittle. Conversations halted mid-sentence, eyes darted away, then back again like nervous birds, and necks craned to get a better look. Some people gasped audibly. Others whispered my name like it was forbidden. It had been nearly 5 years since most of them had seen me. And now, here I was, standing at my father's funeral like an uninvited ghost from a past they'd all tried to forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Gerald Whitaker, the man who had once been my father, lay in a mahogany casket surrounded by lilies and orchestral music piped through hidden speakers. My brother, Richard, sat front and center, his wife Vanessa beside him dabbing at dry eyes, with a pristine handkerchief. Next to them were their twin boys, my nephews, Cameron and Casey, all of them avoiding my gaze as though making eye contact might somehow validate my presence. I knew I wasn't welcome. I knew this space had long stopped including me, but I didn't come for them. I didn't come to make a scene or reopen old wounds. I came because despite everything he had done, Gerald was still my father. And part of me, perhaps the most stubborn part, needed to witness this ending, to mark the final chapter of a story that had shaped my entire life. As I moved slowly down the side aisle, people leaned into each other and whispered urgently. I caught fragments. Is that Eliza? After what happened, how dare she show her face? I didn't react. I kept my chin up, my shoulders square, and chose a seat near the back, quietly placing my purse beside me. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed against my skin like a physical thing, but I wasn't ashamed. They didn't know the whole story. Most never would. The minister spoke, relatives cried, and memories I had carefully locked away came flooding back. Family dinners at the long oak table, fishing trips to Lake Evergreen, the old piano I'd loved to play, and the silence. The thick, suffocating silence that followed that final Thanksgiving when everything fell apart. Then, just when I thought the whispering might subside, Malcolm Pearson stood at the podium, a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, leather portfolio in hand, voice resonant but measured. As the family attorney, I've been instructed to read a portion of Gerald Whitaker's last will and testament immediately following this service, he announced. There was a pause long enough to make every shoulder in the room tense. He adjusted his glasses, glanced across the gathering, and added, Per Mr. Whitaker's explicit instructions, I must specifically request the presence of Ms. Eliza Whitaker. Heads turned in unison. Every pair of eyes, including Richard's, locked on me. His jaw tightened visibly, the color draining from his face until he resembled the photographs of our father in the memorial display. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. No one spoke, no one moved. And in that frozen moment, I realized the real story was only just beginning. Before betrayal rewrote my name into something whispered behind hands, I was simply Eliza, a daughter, a sister, someone who believed in building bridges rather than burning them. My relationship with my father had always been complicated, but for many years, I thought we had something salvageable, something worth preserving. I was born when my father was already in his 40s, a surprise late-in-life child that came 12 years after my brother Richard. By then, my father had already established Whitaker Construction, a company that had started with little more than a pickup truck and a toolbox, but had grown into one of the largest commercial contractors in 3 counties. My mother had died when I was just 8, breast cancer that moved too quickly for medicine to catch. After that, it was just the 3 of us in that too-large colonial house on Maple Hill Drive. Richard was my father's clear favorite from the beginning. The son who showed interest in blueprints and profit margins while I gravitated toward art and literature. But I tried. God knows I tried to be what my father wanted. I studied business in college alongside my art major, learned accounting basics, even spent summers working in different departments of Whitaker Construction just to understand the family legacy. Our family dynamic settled into a predictable pattern. Richard, the heir apparent, always positioned at our father's right hand. Me, the daughter who was tolerated rather than celebrated, always reaching for approval that remained just beyond my fingertips. We weren't a demonstrative family. Emotions were treated like unwelcome guests, acknowledged briefly then shown the door. After college, Richard joined the company immediately, climbing from project manager to vice president within 5 years. I took a different path, opening a small art gallery downtown that showcased local artists. My father never said it outright, but his disappointment hung in the air between us, as tangible as the smell of his cigars that permeated his home office. "Art doesn't build anything lasting, Eliza," he told me once when I invited him to my gallery's opening night. He came for exactly 15 minutes, didn't remove his coat, and left without looking at a single piece. Still, we maintained the rituals of family. Sunday dinners every month, holiday gatherings, birthday calls that never lasted more than 5 minutes. It wasn't warm, but it was what we had, and I told myself it was enough. For years, I believed that beneath my father's stoic exterior beat the heart of a man who simply didn't know how to express affection. I made excuses for his coldness, his dismissive comments, his clear preference for Richard. I built elaborate justifications like carefully constructed houses of cards, fragile but standing. Everything changed when my father turned 70. He announced at a family dinner that he was beginning to think about succession planning for Whitaker Construction. Richard straightened in his chair, his fork paused midway to his mouth. I remember noticing how Vanessa placed her hand on his arm, a small gesture of solidarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Richard's been preparing for this his whole life," my father said, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "But this company represents the Whitaker legacy. It's not a decision I take lightly." I didn't expect to be considered. I'd never wanted to run the construction company, but what my father said next shifted something fundamental between us. "I've decided to bring in an outside consultant to evaluate our leadership structure," he continued. "Someone objective who can assess what's best for the company's future." Richard's face reddened. "An outsider? Dad, I've been working alongside you for 15 years. I know this company inside and out." My father held up his hand, silencing him instantly. "This isn't about loyalty, son. It's about ensuring Whitaker Construction thrives for another generation. Catherine Milligan will be starting next week. I expect you to give her full access to everything she needs." I remember thinking how strange it was that my father, who had never trusted anyone outside the family with company decisions, was suddenly bringing in a consultant. Later, I would understand it as the first warning sign, the initial rumble before an avalanche. Catherine Milligan arrived like a crisp autumn breeze into our stagnant family dynamics. She was in her early 50s, with sharp intelligence behind, her glasses and a directness that matched my father's. I met her by chance one afternoon when I stopped by the company offices to drop off a birthday gift for my father's assistant. "You must be Eliza," she said, extending her hand. "Gerald's daughter, the artist." The way she said artist, without the usual condescension I'd grown accustomed to hearing from my father's business associates, made me pause. "Your father showed me your gallery website," she continued. "Your curation shows remarkable vision, that installation by the local glassblower, extraordinary placement against those textured walls." I blinked in surprise. My father had visited my website? Had actually looked at my work closely enough to discuss it with someone else? Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. My father began calling me more frequently. Just brief conversations, asking about the gallery, mentioning an article he'd read about an emerging artist, even suggesting a potential space when I mentioned wanting to expand. I didn't understand the sudden interest, but I welcomed it. After decades of reaching for connection, it felt like my father was finally extending his hand in return. Richard noticed the shift immediately. At Sunday dinners, his jaw would tighten whenever our father asked about my latest exhibition. He began making small, cutting comments. Must be nice to play with pretty pictures while some of us manage actual business responsibilities. Or, interesting that Dad suddenly finds art. Fascinating after dismissing it for 30 years. I tried to speak with Richard about it once, catching him alone after a family dinner. I'm not trying to compete with you, Rich. I never have been. He laughed, a sharp sound without humor. That's because there's never been a competition. Liz, Dad's building a company, not a fan club. This sudden interest in your little hobby? It's his age showing. Sentimentality. It'll pass. But it didn't pass. Instead, it deepened. My father invited me to attend a charity gala with him, an honor previously reserved only for Richard. He began asking my opinion on things unrelated to art, a property investment he was considering, the restructuring of the company's charitable foundation, small changes, perhaps insignificant to outsiders, but seismic within our family's carefully maintained hierarchy. Then came the Thanksgiving that changed everything. We gathered as usual at my father's house. Richard, Vanessa, their 14-year-old, twins, Catherine Milligan, whose consulting role had somehow extended well beyond its original time frame, and me. The housekeeper had prepared the usual feast, and we sat around the table making careful conversation as we always did. After the pumpkin pie was served, my father cleared his throat. I have an announcement to make, he said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. I've made my decision regarding the future of Whitaker Construction. Richard sat up straighter, his eyes bright with anticipation. Vanessa reached for his hand under the table, not quite hidden from my view. After considerable thought and consultation, my father continued, I've decided to restructure the company leadership. Richard will continue as Chief Operations Officer, overseeing the day-to-day project management that he excels at. Richard's smile faltered slightly. Chief Operations Officer was his current title, not the promotion to CEO he'd been expecting. And, my father said, turning to look directly at me, I'm creating a new position of Creative Director for Commercial Design that I'd like to offer to Eliza. Her artistic vision and connections in the design community would bring a fresh perspective to our commercial projects. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at my father, unable to process what I'd just heard. He was offering me a position in the company? A leadership role? Richard's laugh cut through the silence, sharp as breaking glass. This is a joke, right? Eliza knows nothing about construction, nothing about running projects or managing crews or building anything that doesn't hang on a wall. This isn't about construction knowledge, my father replied calmly. It's about vision, about bringing Whitaker Construction into new markets with distinctive design elements that set us apart from competitors. Catherine's market analysis shows this is where our growth potential lies. Catherine's analysis, Richard repeated, his voice dripping with sudden understanding as he looked between our father and the consultant. I see. This was your recommendation, was it? Catherine met his gaze steadily. It was based on months of evaluation and market research, yes. Richard turned back to our father, his face flushed with anger now. So you're diluting my role and bringing in Eliza, who has shown zero interest in this company for 30 years, because your consultant thinks it's a good idea? I'm expanding the company's vision, my father corrected. And Eliza has shown considerable interest. She spent the last 6 months reviewing our commercial portfolio and providing valuable insights on design elements that could differentiate us in the marketplace. I had done that. At my father's request, I'd looked through their project files, suggested architectural features and design elements that might appeal to higher-end clients. I'd thought it was just my father taking a belated interest in my perspective, never imagining it was an extended job interview. "This is unbelievable," Richard said, pushing back from the table so forcefully that his water glass tipped over. Vanessa quickly righted it, shooting me a look of pure venom. 30 years I've dedicated to this company. 30 years of working my way up, learning every aspect of the business, building relationships with clients and contractors. And now you're telling me I'm going to have to run decisions past my little sister who couldn't tell a joist from a junction box? "That's not what I said," my father replied, his voice hardening. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd moderate your tone at my table." What followed was the most brutal argument I'd ever witnessed between my father and brother. Years of resentment poured out of Richard, accusations that our father had never appreciated his contributions, that I had somehow manipulated my way into his good graces, that Catherine was influencing decisions for her own benefit. My father remained coldly logical, citing company performance metrics and growth projections in the face of Richard's emotional outburst. I sat frozen, feeling simultaneously visible and invisible. Finally, Richard stood, shaking with rage. "If you do this," he said to our father, "if you bring her in against my objections, you'll destroy everything we've built. Everything." "The decision is made," my father replied simply. Richard turned to me then, his eyes burning with a hatred I'd never seen directed at me before. "Congratulations, Eliza. I hope you realize what you're destroying." He grabbed his coat, barked at his family to follow, and slammed out of the house without another word. In the stunned silence that followed, I looked at my father. "Dad, I can't accept this position. Not like this. Richard will never forgive me." My father sipped his bourbon calmly. "Richard will adjust. This isn't about Richard's feelings. It's about what's best for the company." But it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever is when it comes to family. In the weeks that followed, Richard launched what can only be described as a campaign against me. He spoke to every board member, every key employee, every significant client, painting me as an unqualified interloper who had somehow manipulated our aging father into making a disastrous business decision. Rumors began circulating that I was only being brought in because I was sleeping with Catherine, untrue, that I had threatened to contest my father's will if he didn't give me a position, absurd, that I was planning to steer the company away from construction entirely to focus on artsy projects that would bankrupt us. Ridiculous. What hurt most wasn't the lies themselves, but how readily people believed them. People who had known me my entire life, who had watched me grow up, were suddenly looking at me with suspicion and hostility. The narrative Richard created, that I was an opportunistic daughter taking advantage of a father's late-life sentimentality, took root and flourished in the fertile soil of a company culture that had always valued Richard's traditional approach over anything I might represent. I tried to speak with Richard directly, to find some middle ground. I drove to his house one evening after work, only to have Vanessa tell me he wasn't home, though his car was clearly visible in the driveway. I called and left messages that were never returned. I emailed detailed proposals showing how my role could complement his without threatening his authority. Radio silence. The final blow came during a board meeting where I presented my vision for the new creative design division. I'd worked for weeks on the presentation, researching comparable companies, creating mock-ups of potential projects, even securing tentative interest from 2 major clients who were intrigued by the concept of a construction company with integrated design services. I was midway through my presentation when Richard entered the boardroom, 20 minutes late, with a thick folder under his arm. Without apology or preamble, he interrupted me. "Before my sister continues selling you on this fantasy, I think the board should review some concerning information that's recently come to light." He distributed copies of what appeared to be financial documents. As board members began reviewing them, Richard continued, his voice carrying a practiced note of reluctance. These are projections showing the impact of the proposed creative design division on our core business. As you can see, the diversion of resources would significantly impact our traditional revenue streams with only speculative returns. More concerning, however, is page 3. There was a rustling of papers as everyone turned to the indicated page. I looked down at my own copy, my blood running cold as I saw what appeared to be email exchanges between me and a competing construction firm. Emails discussing proprietary information about Whitaker Construction's bidding strategies. Emails I had never written. These exchanges were discovered during a routine IT security audit, Richard continued smoothly. I was as shocked as anyone. But they raised serious questions about whether my sister's sudden interest in joining the company might be motivated by something other than family loyalty. I stood up so quickly my chair rolled back and hit the wall. These are forgeries. I've never communicated with Marshall Brothers Construction in my life. I would never. The IP addresses have been verified, Richard cut in. They came from your gallery's internet connection, Eliza. The room spun around me. I looked to my father, expecting him to defend me, to recognize the obvious setup. Instead, I saw doubt in his eyes. Actual doubt. Dad, I said, my voice breaking. You know I wouldn't do this. My father looked at the documents, then at Richard, then finally at me. His voice when he spoke was tired and old. I think we should adjourn this meeting until we can investigate these allegations properly. That was it. No defense, no immediate rejection of the obvious lies. Just a bureaucratic postponement that left the poison of suspicion to spread unchecked. I resigned that afternoon. I couldn't stay and fight against a brother who was willing to forge evidence, against a father who wasn't certain enough of my character to stand by me without investigation, against a company culture that had always seen me as an outsider. My letter of resignation was brief. I wrote only that I was withdrawing from consideration for any role at Whitaker Construction and would be focusing on my gallery business. I placed it on my father's desk while he was in a closed-door meeting with Richard and the company attorneys. It was the last direct communication I would have with either of them for 5 years. I threw myself into expanding my gallery, channeling all my hurt and rage into building something that was wholly mine. I moved to a different neighborhood, changed my phone number, cut ties with family friends who had chosen sides. I built a new life, brick by brick, each one laid precisely to form a wall between me and the family that had rejected me. My father tried to reach out at first. There were voicemails I deleted without listening to, letters I returned unopened, emissaries in the form of old family friends whom I politely but firmly turned away. I was done explaining myself. Done defending my integrity, done reaching for connection across a divide that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Word reached me, as it inevitably does in small cities, that Richard had been named CEO of Whitaker Construction 6 months after the board meeting incident. Catherine Milligan had departed the company shortly after my resignation. The creative design division was never formed. Life at Whitaker Construction continued as though I had never almost been part of it. I heard, too, about my father's declining health. A stroke, minor but concerning. Then heart problems. Rumors that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations. I received formal notifications about family trust meetings that I never attended, sending my attorney in my place with explicit instructions to agree to whatever was proposed. I didn't want their money. I didn't want anything from them anymore. And then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, I received a call from Malcolm Pearson's office informing me that Gerald Whitaker had passed away in his sleep at the age of 75. The funeral would be held on Friday. My presence, the secretary informed me in carefully neutral tones, had been specifically requested by Mr. Whitaker in his final arrangements. I nearly didn't go. The thought of facing Richard, of enduring the stares and whispers of people who believed I had betrayed my family, made my stomach clench and my hands shake. But something deeper than pride, stronger than hurt, pulled me toward that funeral home. A need for closure, perhaps. Or maybe just the stubborn, persistent hope that even after everything, there might be some final reconciliation, some acknowledgement of the truth. I knew the moment I walked through those doors that no such reconciliation awaited me. The wall of hostility was palpable, the narrative of my betrayal clearly well established in the 5 years of my absence. Richard's smirk when he spotted me, the theatrical way he placed a protective arm around his wife, the deliberate turning of backs as I passed, it all confirmed what I already knew. I was cast as the villain in this family story, the ungrateful daughter who had tried to usurp her brother's birthright and betrayed her father's trust. So I sat alone in that back pew, listening to eulogies that painted a picture of my father. I barely recognized a warm, generous mentor, a community pillar, a devoted family man. I wondered if perhaps there had been a version of Gerald Whitaker that existed only for others, never for me. And then Malcolm Pearson announced the will reading, specifically requesting my presence, and suddenly every eye in the room was on me once more. Richard's face, which had maintained a mask of dignified grief throughout the service, suddenly went slack with surprise, then tight with alarm. In that moment, watching the color drain from my brother's face, I felt the first inkling that perhaps my father's final act might contain some unexpected twist. As people filed out toward the reception area, several shooting curious glances between Richard and me, I remained seated, waiting. Whatever was coming, I would face it with the same dignity I'd maintained for 5 long years of exile. I owed myself that much, even if I owed this family nothing. Malcolm approached me after the room had nearly emptied. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, formally, though he had known me since childhood. "The reading will take place in the funeral home's private conference room in 15 minutes. Your father was quite specific about certain arrangements." I nodded, not trusting my voice. As Malcolm turned to leave, he hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "He spoke of you often, you know, especially toward the end." Before I could ask what he meant, Richard appeared at Malcolm's elbow, his face composed once more, but his eyes burning with barely contained fury. "What is this about, Malcolm?" he demanded. "Why wasn't I informed that Eliza would be specifically mentioned in the will reading?" Malcolm adjusted his glasses calmly. "All will be explained in 15 minutes, Richard. Your father's instructions were quite clear." As they walked away, I caught the venomous look Richard threw over his shoulder at me. In that moment, I realized that whatever was about to happen, my brother feared it, and that fear was directed at me. The conference room was small but well-appointed, with a polished mahogany table and leather chairs. Richard and Vanessa sat on one side, the twins flanking them like solemn-faced bookends. A few other relatives, my father's sister Judith, his brother-in-law Frank, a cousin from Chicago whose name I couldn't remember, scattered themselves around the remaining chairs. I chose a seat at the far end, as distant from Richard as the table allowed. Malcolm entered last, carrying a leather portfolio and what appeared to be a small wooden box. He placed both on the table, then cleared his throat. Gerald Whitaker prepared this final will and testament 3 months ago, revoking all previous versions. He was of sound mind and body, as attested by his physician and 2 witnesses with no interest in his estate. Malcolm's eyes flickered, briefly to Richard. He asked that I specifically note this for the record. Richard shifted in his seat, but said nothing. "I'll dispense with the legal preamble and proceed directly to the distribution of assets as Gerald requested," Malcolm continued. He opened the portfolio and began reading. The first portions were unsurprising. The family home to Richard, specific bequests to various relatives, charitable donations to the organizations my father had supported during his lifetime. Richard's expression grew increasingly smug as each item confirmed his expectations. Then Malcolm turned a page and paused, adjusting his glasses before continuing. "To my daughter, Eliza Catherine Whitaker, I leave the following: First, my sincere apology. The words are inadequate, but they must be said. I failed you as a father in ways I only fully recognized too late. I allowed lies to cloud my judgment and pride to prevent me from acknowledging my mistake. For this, I can only ask forgiveness I have not earned. The room went completely still. Richard's face froze in an expression of disbelief. I felt something inside me crack, a hairline fracture in the protective shell I'd built around my heart. Malcolm continued reading. Second, I leave you my controlling interest, 51% of the shares, in Whitaker Construction Company, with the explicit instruction that you be immediately installed as Chief Executive Officer. A strangled sound came from Richard's direction. Vanessa gasped audibly. I sat perfectly still, certain I had misheard. This is impossible, Richard said, his voice rising. The company shares were already distributed. I own 49%. Dad owned 51%. It's been that way for years. Malcolm looked at him calmly. Your father restructured his holdings 6 months ago, Richard. He created a separate trust to hold his controlling interest. That trust now passes to Eliza. There must be some mistake, Vanessa interjected, her voice high and brittle. Gerald would never, if I may continue, Malcolm said firmly. There is more. He lifted the wooden box and placed it in front of him. In addition to his controlling interest, Gerald leaves to Eliza his personal document safe, containing materials he described as evidence of the truth. He specifically instructed that this box be opened in the presence of both his children at this reading. Malcolm produced a small key and unlocked the box. From inside, he removed a sealed envelope and a USB drive. The envelope contains a personal letter for Eliza's eyes only, he explained. The USB drive contains digital copies of emails and recorded conversations that Gerald collected over the past 4 years. He instructed me to inform you all that these provide conclusive evidence that the documents presented against Eliza at the board meeting 5 years ago were forgeries created under Richard's direction, with the assistance of the IT director, who has since been terminated from the company. Richard's face, already pale, now turned the color of chalk. Beside him, Vanessa began to tremble visibly. That's slander, Richard managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad was confused. In his final months, this is... The evidence has been verified by 2 independent digital forensics experts, Malcolm interrupted. Their reports are included on the drive. Gerald wanted the record set straight, Richard. He wanted the truth known. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The vindication I had stopped hoping for years ago was suddenly being handed to me in front of the very people who had cast me out. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold before me. There is one final provision, Malcolm said, turning back to his papers. Gerald recognized that this revelation and transfer of control would be disruptive. He therefore included the following contingency. Should Eliza choose not to accept the controlling interest and CEO position, these shares will be placed in a charitable trust benefiting arts education programs across the state. Richard would remain in his current position, but would report to a board controlled by this trust. Under no circumstances are the shares to pass to Richard directly. Malcolm closed the portfolio and looked at me. The choice is yours, Ms. Whitaker. Your father wanted you to have options, not obligations. In the silence that followed, I could hear Richard's ragged breathing, could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon me. The brother who had systematically destroyed my reputation, forged evidence against me, and pushed me out of my family now sat before me, his future literally in my hands. I reached for the envelope Malcolm had placed before me. My name was written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting, the letters slightly shakier than I remembered. I opened it carefully and unfolded the single page inside. Eliza, by the time you read this, I will be gone. and words of regret will mean little. But I must write them anyway. I was wrong. Wrong to doubt you. Wrong to let Richard's manipulations go unchallenged. Wrong to choose comfortable lies over difficult truth. I discovered the forgeries 2 years after you left, when Catherine sent me evidence she had been gathering since her own abrupt departure. My first instinct was to call you immediately, to beg forgiveness, to make things right. But pride stopped me. That same cursed pride that had blinded me for so long. Instead, I began quietly investigating, gathering proof, planning how to restore not just your name but your rightful place in the company that should always have included your vision alongside your brother's practicality. The balance I was too stubborn to see. I don't ask you to forgive Richard. What he did was unforgivable. I ask only that you consider returning to lead Whitaker Construction into a future that needs your creativity more than it needs his caution. The company was built with hands, but it could soar with heart. Your heart, which always saw beauty where the rest of us saw only function. Whatever you decide, know that my deepest regret was not telling you what I finally understood too. You were always enough exactly as you were. It was I who was not enough of a father to see it. With love and remorse, Dad. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, aware that my hands were perfectly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. 5 years of anger, of hurt, of carefully constructed independence, all of it colliding with this unexpected acknowledgement, this posthumous vindication. I looked up to find Richard staring at me, his expression a complex mixture of rage, fear, and something that might have been shame. "Well," he said, his voice strained. "Are you happy now? You've won. You destroyed this family and now you've won." I studied my brother's face, the face I'd once looked up to, had sought approval from, had trusted despite years of subtle undermining. I felt nothing but a profound weariness. "I didn't destroy anything, Richard," I said quietly. "But I'm going to rebuild it." I turned to Malcolm. "I accept the controlling interest and the position. I'll be at the office on Monday morning to begin the transition." Richard pushed back his chair violently and stood. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You have no idea how to run this company. You'll fail within a year, and when you do— when— "I do," I interrupted calmly. "You'll be the first person I call for advice, because despite everything, we're still family. And family businesses need both tradition and innovation to survive." Dad finally understood that. "Maybe someday you will too." Richard stared at me for a long moment, his face working through emotions too complex to name. Then, without another word, he turned and strode from the room, Vanessa hurrying after him. As the door closed behind them, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first loosening of a knot that had been tightly bound for too long. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, resentment, skepticism about my abilities, the same challenges I would have faced 5 years ago, but now without my father's support. Yet somehow, holding his letter, knowing he had finally seen the truth, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I had already proven everything to myself in the years I spent rebuilding my life from the ground up. As people filed out of the conference room, some avoiding my eyes, others offering tentative congratulations, Malcolm approached me once more. "Your father was very proud of what you built on your own," he said quietly. "He visited your gallery, often, you know, always in disguise, a hat, sunglasses. He bought several pieces through intermediaries. I hadn't known." The thought of my father secretly supporting my work, too stubborn or ashamed to do so openly, brought a fresh wave of complicated grief. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Malcolm nodded. "He wanted to make things right, Eliza. In the end, this was the only way he knew how." As I left the funeral home that afternoon, stepping into sunlight that seemed surprisingly bright after the dimness inside, I realized that the whispers and stares had taken on a different quality. Word had already begun to spread about the shocking contents of the will, about the evidence exonerating me, about Richard's disgrace. But none of that mattered as much as the weight of the envelope in my purse and the knowledge that, in his final act, my father had chosen truth over comfort. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a foundation upon which something new might be built. And I had always been good at seeing the potential in foundations. The days following my father's funeral unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. I moved through them with a strange sense of detachment, as if watching myself from a distance. The weight of the wooden box Malcolm had given me, now sitting on my kitchen counter, anchored me to a reality I was still struggling to fully accept. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue as I stood outside the Whitaker construction headquarters. The 12-story building with its glass and steel facade had always impressed me, with its solidity, its uncompromising presence in the city skyline. Now, looking up at it, I felt a mixture of determination and vertigo. This imposing structure was partly mine now. The company it housed was mine to lead. I had dressed carefully that morning, a charcoal pantsuit that communicated authority without aggression, a silk blouse in a deep teal that had always been my signature color, minimal jewelry except for my mother's silver pendant. My armor, assembled piece by piece. I'd pulled my hair back into a sleek chignon, applied makeup that enhanced without distracting. Every choice deliberate, nothing left to chance. As I pushed through the revolving door into the marble-floored lobby, the security guard's eyes widened, in recognition. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise despite his professional demeanor. "Good morning, Edward," I replied, remembering his name from years ago. "It's been a while." He hesitated, clearly uncertain about protocol. The last time he'd seen me, I'd been storming out of the building, resignation letter clutched in my hand, eyes bright with unshed tears. Now I was returning as CEO. "Mr. Pearson called ahead," he finally said, reaching beneath his desk to produce a temporary access badge. "Said to give you full clearance to all floors and departments." I accepted the badge with a nod of thanks. "I appreciate that. And Edward? It's good to see a familiar face." His expression softened slightly. "Welcome back, Ms. Whitaker." The elevator ride to the executive floor seemed both interminable and too brief. I used those moments to center myself, to remember why I was here. Not for revenge, though the temptation lingered like a sweet poison on my tongue. Not even for vindication, though my father's posthumous acknowledgement had begun healing wounds I'd thought permanent. I was here because Whitaker Construction represented generations of hard work, because it employed hundreds of people who depended on its success, and because, despite everything, it was still family. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the executive reception area. Olivia Chen, my father's longtime executive assistant, stood frozen behind her desk, clearly having been warned of my arrival, but still startled by the reality of it. Behind her, through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see several members of the executive team gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Richard was noticeably absent. "Olivia," I said, stepping forward with my hand extended. "It's been too long." She took my hand automatically, years of professional training overriding whatever personal feelings she might harbor. "Ms. Whitaker, we weren't sure you'd actually come." "I imagine there are a lot of things people aren't sure about regarding me," I replied evenly. "I'm hoping to clarify some of those uncertainties today." Her eyes flickered toward the conference room. "The executive team is assembled for the morning briefing. Mr. Richard usually chairs it, but he called to say he wouldn't be in today." No surprise there. Richard was making a statement with his absence, hoping to undermine my first day by forcing me to face the team without context or preparation. It was exactly the kind of calculated move I'd come to expect from him. Perfect. Timing, then, I said with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Would you let them know I'll be joining them in 5 minutes? I'd like to see my father's office first. Your office now, Olivia corrected automatically, then looked surprised at her own words. It's been kept as he left it. Mr. Richard preferred to use his own. Another power play. By refusing to occupy our father's office, Richard had been making a show of respecting Gerald's memory while simultaneously creating a separate power base, leaving the CEO's office as a shrine while operating from his own territory. Thank you, Olivia. I'll find my way. The corner office at the end of the hallway had always intimidated me as a child. The heavy oak door, the frosted glass with Gerald Whitaker, Chief Executive Officer, etched in authoritative block letters, the hushed way people spoke when they approached it. All of it designed to convey power and demand respect. I'd rarely been invited inside, and when I had, it had usually been to receive some criticism thinly veiled as advice. Now, I stood before that door, key card in hand, aware of the eyes watching from various vantage points around the floor. With a deep breath, I swiped the card and pushed the door open. The office was exactly as I remembered, yet somehow smaller. The massive desk still dominated the space, its surface meticulously organized with items placed at right angles. The leather chairs, the wall of awards and certificates, the scale models of Whitaker Construction's most significant projects displayed in custom cases, all preserved as if my father might walk in at any moment. I moved slowly around the space, noting the thin layer of dust on some surfaces, evidence that the cleaning staff had been instructed to disturb as little as possible. On the credenza behind the desk, a collection of framed photographs caught my eye. My father at various groundbreaking ceremonies, Richard receiving an industry award, the Whitaker men through 3 generations, and there, partially hidden behind a larger frame, a small photo I didn't recognize. I picked it up, wiping dust from the glass with my thumb. It was me at the opening of my first gallery exhibition. I was laughing at something off camera, looking younger and more carefree than I remembered ever feeling. I had no memory of my father attending that event or taking this photograph. In fact, I was certain he hadn't been there. Yet here was evidence that he had come, had witnessed that moment of triumph in my life, had preserved it among his personal mementos. Had he been standing in the back, unnoticed? Had he slipped away before I could see him? The questions settled in my chest like stones. The answers forever beyond my reach now. I replaced the photograph, positioning it more prominently this time, and turned toward the desk. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, I had an executive team waiting to take my measure. The conversation in the conference room ceased abruptly as I entered. 8 faces turned toward me, expressions carefully composed into professional neutrality that didn't quite mask the tension beneath. I recognized most of them from my previous time at the company, though there were 2 newer faces as well. "Good morning," I said, moving to the head of the table where my father would have sat. "Thank you for accommodating this last-minute change to your regular meeting schedule." No one responded immediately. Then Charles Webb, the chief financial officer who had been with the company since before I was born, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitaker, we were surprised by the developments at the will reading." "I imagine so," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I was equally surprised, but here we are." "Why, we understood that Richard would be transitioning into the CEO role permanently," said Diane Mercer, the HR director. "Many announcements were already in preparation." I nodded. "I understand the situation creates some organizational challenges. That's partly why I wanted to meet with all of you immediately, to address concerns and establish clear direction moving forward." "With all due respect," said a man I didn't recognize, leaning forward with barely concealed hostility. "What qualifies you to provide clear direction for a construction company?" Your background is in art, correct? And you are? I asked calmly. Jason Trent, VP of Business Development. I joined Whitaker 3 years ago. Mr. Trent, that's an excellent question. Let me address it directly. I opened the portfolio I'd brought with me and distributed copies of a document to everyone at the table. This is my resume, updated to include my complete educational and professional background. You'll note that in addition to my MFA, I hold an MBA from Wharton with a focus on organizational leadership. My gallery business has grown 300% in 5 years, expanded to 3 locations, and maintains profit margins well above industry standard. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. You'll also see that I've served on the boards of 3 different architectural preservation societies and have extensive connections throughout the design and arts communities that represent potential new client bases for Whitaker Construction. The surprise on several faces confirmed what I had suspected. Richard had deliberately mischaracterized my background, emphasizing my artistic pursuits while omitting my business credentials. That said, I continued, I don't pretend to have the construction industry experience that many of you possess. That's why my leadership approach will be collaborative rather than directive. I believe in leveraging the expertise in this room while bringing fresh perspective from outside. Traditional industry thinking. Charles Webb was studying my resume with raised eyebrows. This is more extensive than I was led to believe. I imagine many things about me have been misrepresented, Mr. Webb, which brings me to my next point. I withdrew a USB drive from my portfolio, not my father's, but one I had prepared myself. This contains my initial strategic vision for Whitaker Construction, along with some specific proposals I'd like you all to review before our follow-up meeting tomorrow. Tomorrow? Diane Mercer looked startled. That's very fast. We have a company to run, Ms. Mercer. I don't believe in wasting time, especially when there are projects in progress and clients expecting continuity of service. I inserted the drive into the conference room's computer, bringing up my presentation on the wall screen. The core of my vision is this. Whitaker Construction has built its reputation on solid, reliable commercial projects. That foundation remains essential. But to grow in today's market, we need to differentiate ourselves. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined my strategy, expanding into specialized design-forward commercial projects, creating a dedicated sustainability division focused on green building techniques, developing partnerships with innovative architectural firms. I presented market research, competitive analyses, and financial projections I had been quietly working on since receiving Malcolm's call about my father's death. The initial skepticism in the room gradually shifted to reluctant interest, then to active engagement as executives began asking questions, pointing out challenges, suggesting modifications. By the time I concluded, the atmosphere had transformed from hostile resistance to cautious professional consideration. These are ambitious goals, said Charles Webb finally. But the numbers are sound, and the market opportunity is convincing. I have concerns about implementation timeline and resource allocation, but those are details we can work through. That's exactly what I want to hear, Mr. Webb. Critical analysis, not blind acceptance. I expect all of you to review these proposals thoroughly and come prepared tomorrow with your honest assessments, both positive and negative. As the meeting concluded and executives filed out, many nodding respectfully in my direction, I felt the first real sense that this transition might actually work. Not easily, not without resistance, but possibly with less outright sabotage than I had feared. Charles Webb lingered after the others had left. He had been my father's trusted financial advisor for decades, a conservative, meticulous man who rarely revealed his thoughts directly. Your father would be surprised, he said finally, gathering his papers. By my presentation? By how much you remind me of him. Webb's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held something like reluctant approval. He was also underestimated. When he first took over from his father, also came in with ideas people called too ambitious. I hadn't known that about my father. The Gerald Whitaker I knew had always seemed immovably established, his authority absolute and unquestioned. "Thank you for that perspective, Mr. Webb." He nodded once, then hesitated at the door. "Richard won't accept this easily. He's been working toward the CEO position his entire life." "I know. He has strong allies within the company and among our clients." "I'm aware of that as well." Webb studied me for a moment longer. "Your design initiatives have merit. The sustainability division especially. I've been advocating for something similar for years." With that surprising revelation, he departed, leaving me alone in the conference room, surrounded by the remnants of my first executive meeting. Coffee cups, notepads filled with hastily scribbled notes, and the lingering sense that I had passed an important first test. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of introductions, facility tours, and mountains of paperwork requiring my signature. I met department heads, reviewed active projects, and began the process of absorbing the day-to-day operations of a company far larger and more complex than my gallery business. It was nearly 7 in the evening when I finally returned to my office, mentally exhausted but oddly energized. I had expected the day to be challenging, had prepared for outright hostility, but the reality had been more nuanced. There was suspicion, yes, and reservation, but also a surprising willingness among many staff to reserve judgment, to give the new CEO a chance to prove herself. I was gathering my things to leave when Olivia knocked softly on the open door. "Ms. Whitaker, there's someone here to see you." I looked up, expecting perhaps Charles Webb with additional financial documents or one of the other executives with follow-up questions from our meeting. Instead, Casey Whitaker, one of Richard's 16-year-old twins, stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his lanky frame radiating teenage discomfort. "Casey," I said, surprised. Of all the people I might have expected to visit on my first day, my nephew was among the least likely. "Come in." He stepped into the office, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps he was. Richard had likely kept his sons away from my father's private domain, just as he had tried to exclude me. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," he blurted out, still not meeting my eyes directly. "She'd be super mad." "I appreciate you taking that risk then," I said carefully. "What can I do for you?" Casey shifted his weight from foot to foot. I wanted to see if it was true. What Dad said about you. What did your father say? That you were going to destroy the company. That you don't know anything about construction and you're just doing this to get back at him. Casey finally looked up, his expression troubled. "But then Grandpa left you in charge, so that doesn't make sense, and I don't know what's true anymore." The raw confusion in his voice hit me harder than any of the veiled hostility I'd faced in the executive meeting. This wasn't about corporate politics or succession plans. This was about a teenager trying to reconcile conflicting narratives about his family. "That's a fair question, Casey. Why don't you sit down?" I gestured to one of the visitor chairs, taking the one beside it rather than remaining behind the imposing desk. "I can tell you my truth, and you can decide for yourself what to believe." He sat tentatively, perched on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. "The short answer is no, I'm not here to destroy the company or to get revenge on your father," I said. "Whitaker Construction represents generations of hard work. Your great-grandfathers, your grandfathers, and yes, your fathers too. I respect that legacy too much to damage it out of spite." "But you and Dad hate each other," Casey said with the blunt certainty of youth. I considered my response carefully. "Your father and I have a complicated relationship. We've hurt each other in ways that are difficult to repair. But hate? No. Disappointment, anger, frustration, yes. But not hate." "Then why are you taking over? Dad's been working here forever. You haven't. That's true. Your father has dedicated his life to this company, and he deserves recognition for that commitment. But a company isn't just about who's put in the most years. It's about who brings the right vision for its future. I leaned forward slightly. Your grandfather believed I could bring something valuable to Whitaker Construction. A fresh perspective, new ideas that could help it grow in changing markets. That doesn't erase your father's contributions or expertise. Casey frowned, processing this. So what happens to Dad now? That's largely up to him, I said honestly. I want him to stay with the company. His experience is invaluable, and there's no reason we can't work together, if he's willing. He won't be, Casey said flatly. He's really angry. He broke stuff when he got home from the funeral. I've never seen him like that before. The image of my controlled, calculating brother losing his composure so completely was difficult to imagine, and concerning. I'm sorry you had to see that. It can be scary when adults we rely on show that kind of anger. Casey shrugged, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. Cameron thinks it's cool, all the drama. He says it's like a TV show about rich people fighting over money. And what do you think? He hesitated. I think it sucks. Everything was fine before, and now everyone's mad and weird and nothing makes sense. The simple truth of his assessment hit me with unexpected force. In the adult complexities of inheritance and corporate control, it was easy to forget the collateral damage to the youngest members of the family. Teenagers suddenly caught in an emotional crossfire not of their making. You're right, I said. It does suck. And I'm sorry that you and your brother are caught in the middle of adult problems that aren't your fault. Casey looked surprised at my agreement. So what happens now? Are you going to fire Dad? No, absolutely not. As I said, I want your father to stay with the company in a leadership role. The choice to stay or leave will be his. And if he leaves? Then that will be a loss for Whitaker Construction, but the company will continue. And whatever happens between your father and me professionally, you should know that I'm still your aunt. That doesn't change. Casey studied me with an intensity that reminded me suddenly, painfully, of my father. I don't really know you, though. You disappeared when I was like 11. The simple observation carried no accusation, yet it struck deeper than any of the day's more direct confrontations. He was right. I had vanished from my nephews' lives, too hurt and angry to maintain connections that might have kept me tethered to the family that had rejected me. That's true, I acknowledged, and I regret that. It wasn't fair to you or your brother. Dad said you abandoned the family because you were jealous. I left because I was hurt, I corrected gently. Sometimes when people are hurt badly, enough, they need to step away to heal. It doesn't mean they stop caring. Casey absorbed this, then asked with surprising directness, Did Dad really fake emails to make you look bad? That's what people at the funeral were saying. I hesitated, torn between honesty and the awareness that I was speaking about his father. Yes, I finally said. According to evidence your grandfather collected, that did happen. Why would he do that? Fear, probably, I said after a moment's reflection. Fear of change, fear of losing control of something he'd worked for his entire life. People sometimes make terrible choices when they're afraid. Casey looked down at his hands. That's really messed up. Yes, it is. But you're still willing to work with him after that? I hadn't expected such insightful questioning from a 16-year-old. But I was beginning to realize I had underestimated my nephew. I'm willing to try, yes. Not because what happened wasn't serious, but because moving forward is more important than holding on to the past. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending harm didn't occur. It means choosing not to let that harm control your future. Casey nodded slowly, seeming to find something valuable in my words. I should go. Mom will start calling soon. As he stood to leave, I felt a sudden reluctance to end this unexpected connection. "Casey, thank you for coming. It was brave of you." He shrugged, teenage nonchalance reasserting itself. "Whatever, I was curious." "Well, my door is always open if you're curious about anything else, or if you just want to talk." He paused at the threshold. "The stuff you showed the executives today, about new building designs and green construction and all that, is that really happening?" "I hope so. Why?" "I'm in AP Environmental Science. We're doing a project on sustainable architecture." A brief flash of enthusiasm broke through his careful teenage indifference. "It's actually pretty cool." I felt a surge of something unexpected, a connection, a shared interest I'd never had the chance to discover. "If you're interested, I have some books and materials that might help with your project." "Yeah?" "Yes. And if you wanted to see some sustainable design elements in action, I could arrange a tour of a project my gallery helped fund, a community arts center built entirely with recycled materials and renewable energy systems." The cautious interest in his eyes was worth more than any of the professional victories I'd achieved that day. "That might be cool, if I can get Mom to agree." "Let me worry about that part," I said, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. Sometimes adults need to put aside their differences when it matters to the next generation. After Casey left, I remained in the office a while longer, watching darkness settle over the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My first day as CEO had brought challenges I'd anticipated, and opportunities I hadn't. The path ahead remained steep and uncertain, but for the first time since walking into my father's funeral, I felt something that had been missing for 5 long years, a sense of possibility. Not just for Whitaker construction, but for connections I'd thought permanently severed. Casey's visit had opened a door I'd assumed forever closed. It was a small opening, fragile and uncertain, but it existed where before there had been only a wall. As I finally gathered my things to leave, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "Aunt Eliza? It's Cameron. Casey told me about your sustainable building stuff. Sounds cool. Maybe I could check it out too sometime?" I smiled as I typed my reply. "Absolutely. Anytime. My door is always open." 3 simple words that represented everything I hoped to rebuild. Not just a company, but a family fractured by pride and fear and misunderstanding. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But as I switched off the office lights and stepped into the hallway, I carried with me something I hadn't expected to find on this first day of my new role. Hope. By the end of my first week as CEO of Whitaker Construction, I had developed a new appreciation for the phrase, baptism by fire. Each day brought fresh challenges, some expected, others blindsiding me with their intensity or complexity. I worked 14-hour days, absorbing decades of institutional knowledge, meeting key clients, reviewing active projects, and navigating the complex interpersonal dynamics of a company where loyalties remained divided. Richard had yet to appear at the office. His absence spoke volumes, creating a vacuum that both hindered and helped my transition. Without him physically present to rally opposition, some of his strongest supporters had begun cautiously engaging with my initiatives. Yet critical decisions requiring his project knowledge remained in limbo, and rumors about his next move circulated through the company like electricity through copper wire. Friday evening found me alone in my office, surrounded by project files and financial reports, my jacket discarded over a chair, sleeves rolled up as I compared construction timelines against resource allocations. The executive floor was quiet, most employees having departed hours earlier for weekend plans and family obligations. A soft knock interrupted my concentration. I looked up to find Olivia standing in the doorway, her typically perfect appearance, showing signs of the long week. "Ms. Whitaker, there's someone here to see you." "At this hour? Who is it?" Vanessa Whitaker. I set down my pen, surprised. Richard's wife was the last person I expected to appear at my office, especially unannounced on a Friday evening. Our relationship had always been strained at best, openly hostile at worst. Vanessa had joined the family when I was in college, aligning herself firmly with Richard from the beginning, and regarding me with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for potential rivals. "Send her in," I said, quickly gathering the scattered papers into something resembling order. Vanessa entered with the controlled poise I remembered, back straight, chin slightly elevated, every aspect of her appearance meticulously curated. Her camel coat was draped perfectly over a navy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek chignon similar to my own, an irony that didn't escape me. "Eliza," she said, her voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the visitor's chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down." She settled into the chair with practiced grace, placing her designer handbag precisely beside her. Up close, I could see the signs of strain beneath her polished exterior, the slight tightness around her eyes, the barely perceptible tension in her jaw. "I imagine you're wondering why I'm here," she began. The thought did cross my mind. She glanced around the office, taking in the changes I'd already implemented. My father's hunting trophies removed, replaced with selected artwork from local artists. The heavy drapes opened to reveal the city skyline. Fresh flowers on the credenza where dusty memorabilia had once stood. "You've certainly made the space your own quickly," she observed, a hint of accusation in her tone. "Change can be healthy," I replied neutrally. "What can I do for you, Vanessa?" She met my eyes directly for the first time. "I want to know your intentions regarding Richard's position at the company. I believe I've made those clear. I want Richard to remain as Go! His experience and knowledge are valuable assets to Whitaker Construction. And you expect him to simply accept demotion? To report to his younger sister after spending his entire career preparing to lead this company?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "I expect him to act in the best interest of the company he claims to care about. And technically, it's not a demotion. He's retaining his current title and responsibilities. The only change is the reporting structure." "Don't be disingenuous, Eliza. It doesn't suit you." Vanessa's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the arm of her chair. "Richard has effectively been running this company for the past 3 years while your father's health declined. Everyone knows that. And yet my father chose to place me in charge. That should tell you something." A flash of genuine anger broke through her composed facade. "It tells me that you somehow manipulated a dying man into changing his will. It tells me that you saw an opportunity for revenge and took it. Is that what Richard believes? That I orchestrated this from afar?" "I hadn't spoken to our father in 5 years, Vanessa. I didn't even know he was seriously ill until Malcolm called about the funeral arrangements." "Then how do you explain it?" she demanded. "Gerald always intended the company to go to Richard. Everyone knew that. Then suddenly, after years of no contact, you're named CEO and given controlling interest? It doesn't make sense." I considered my response carefully. "Have you seen the evidence my father collected? The emails? The recorded conversations?" She looked away. "Richard says those are taken out of context, that your father misunderstood. There's not much room for misinterpretation in forged emails and explicit discussions about how to remove me from consideration for a position I never even knew I was being evaluated for." Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. "Business can be cutthroat. Richard did what he thought was necessary to protect the company's future." "From what? From me? What exactly was I going to do that required such extreme measures? Suggest we incorporate better design elements? Propose we develop a sustainability division? These weren't radical ideas that threatened the company's existence. "You don't understand," she said, her voice tightening. "Richard has sacrificed everything for Whitaker Construction. Everything. While you were off playing with your little gallery, he was here 7 days a week, missing family events, postponing vacations, putting this company ahead of everything. Else because that's what Gerald expected of him." The bitterness in her voice surprised me. This wasn't just about corporate succession or family legacy. This was personal for Vanessa in ways I hadn't anticipated. "That sounds difficult," I said carefully. "For all of you." She laughed, a brittle sound without humor. "You have no idea. Do you know what it's like to compete with a company for your husband's attention? To plan family celebrations knowing they'll probably be interrupted by some work emergency? To watch your children grow up wondering why their father's office always takes precedence over their baseball games and school concerts?" The raw pain beneath her polished exterior caught me off guard. For years, I'd seen Vanessa as simply an extension of Richard, his loyal wife, his social partner, another member of the united front against me. I'd never considered her as someone with her own grievances, her own disappointments. "No," I admitted. "I don't know what that's like. And I'm sorry your family has had to endure that." My sincere response seemed to throw her momentarily. She blinked, recalibrating. "Richard is considering legal action," she said, regaining her composure. "He believes there are grounds to contest the will based on undue influence." "That would be a mistake," I replied evenly. My father anticipated that response. The evidence he gathered isn't just about what happened 5 years ago. It includes recent conversations where Richard explicitly discussed challenging any attempt to change the succession plan. Malcolm has prepared a comprehensive defense that would only result in publicly exposing details Richard would prefer remain private. Vanessa paled slightly. "What details?" "I think you should ask your husband that question." She studied me for a long moment. "What do you want, Eliza? Really? Is it just the company? Or is it seeing Richard brought down?" The question deserved an honest answer. "What I want is to honor my father's final wishes by leading this company toward a future he believed in. I want to preserve what works while implementing changes that will keep us competitive in a changing market. And yes, I want acknowledgement of the wrong that was done to me. Not through Richard's humiliation, but through his recognition and accountability." "And if he can't give you that? Then we'll have to find a way forward without it. But the company will move forward, with or without Richard's participation." Vanessa rose abruptly, gathering her purse. "You've clearly made up your mind." "My door remains open," I said, standing as well. "To Richard, to you, to the boys. Whatever happens professionally doesn't have to destroy what's left of our family." She paused, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Casey mentioned you offered to show him some sustainable building project." "Yes, he and Cameron both seemed interested. I thought it might be educational for their environmental science class." Vanessa hesitated, internal conflict visible in the tight line of her mouth. "Richard wouldn't approve." "Richard doesn't need to know," I suggested quietly. "Sometimes children need spaces away from parental conflicts, places where they can form their own opinions. They're not pawns to be used in this game, Eliza." "I agree completely." "Which is why I'm offering them something separate from the tension between their father and me. An educational opportunity related to their interests. Nothing more." She considered this, then gave a short nod. "I'll think about it." After Vanessa left, I remained at my desk, turning our conversation over in my mind. It had revealed complexities I hadn't fully considered. The toll Richard's dedication to the company had taken on his family, the genuine pain beneath Vanessa's hostile exterior, the possibility that Richard's obsession with controlling Whitaker construction stemmed from more than just ambition or entitlement. None of this excused what he had done, but it provided context I had been missing. Understanding the fuller picture didn't change my path forward, but it did illuminate the terrain. I was navigating with greater clarity. My phone chimed with a text message. I expected it to be from Charles Webb or another executive with last-minute questions before the weekend. Instead, it was from Malcolm Pearson. Ms. Whitaker, something has come to my attention that we should discuss as soon as possible. Are you available for breakfast tomorrow? 8 new at the Capitol Grill? The formal tone and request for an in-person meeting rather than a phone call suggested something significant. I typed my agreement, then gathered my things to finally head home, the peaceful weekend I had hoped for already evaporating before it began. The Capitol Grill was nearly empty when I arrived at precisely 8 the next morning. Malcolm had secured a corner table, maximizing privacy in the already discreet environment. He stood as I approached, impeccably dressed as always in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Ms. Whitaker, thank you for meeting on such short notice, he said, waiting until I was seated before resuming his own chair. You stay with the company in a restructured role. You work with me and our financial team to gradually unwind these improper arrangements without raising red flags externally. You make full restitution over time. And most importantly, you commit to complete transparency and ethical conduct moving forward. Richard stared at me in disbelief. You'd let me stay? After everything? Under strict conditions and close supervision, yes. Not because you deserve it, but because it's what's best for the company, for the employees who depend on Whitaker Construction for their livelihoods, and for our family. Why would you do that? I considered my answer carefully. Because I believe in second chances. Because despite everything, you have valuable expertise this company needs. And because I think Dad would have wanted me to offer you a path to redemption if you're willing to take it. Richard's composure cracked then, his face contorting with emotions too complex to name. For a moment, I glimpsed the frightened boy, beneath the ruthless businessman, the child who had spent his life chasing approval he never quite believed he deserved. I don't understand you, Eliza, he said finally, his voice rough. I destroyed evidence to force you out. I turned Dad against you. I've fought your return every step of the way. And now, when you have everything you need to destroy me completely, you're offering mercy? Not mercy, I corrected him. Accountability with an opportunity for growth. There's a difference. And if I refuse, if I fight this, claim the evidence is fabricated, then I'll have no choice but to pursue the first option. The evidence is overwhelming, Richard. Dad made sure of that. He fell silent, the weight of his position visibly settling on him. I need time to think, he said finally. You have until the end of the week to decide. But whatever you choose, the financial manipulations end immediately. I've already instructed our IT department to grant me access to all project management systems, and our new CFO will be reviewing every transaction over a certain threshold. Richard nodded slowly, the fight draining from him. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Why didn't you just take the company and fire me on day one? It would have been simpler. Simpler, yes, but not better. Whitaker Construction isn't just about buildings, Richard. It's about legacy, the structures we create and the values we uphold while creating them. Dad lost sight of that somewhere along the way. I don't intend to make the same mistake. After he left, I sat quietly in my office, listening to the sounds of the company continuing its work beyond my door. The conversation had gone differently than I'd anticipated, less confrontational, more revelatory. I had glimpsed aspects of my brother I'd never fully understood, vulnerabilities beneath the armor of arrogance and entitlement. It didn't excuse what he had done. Nothing could. But it offered a framework for understanding, and perhaps eventually for healing. Not just for Richard, but for our fractured family and for the company that bore our name. My phone buzzed with a text message from Casey. Mom said we could check out that sustainable building project next weekend if you're still willing to show us. I smiled as I typed my reply. Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Small steps, tiny openings in walls that had seemed impenetrable. Not forgiveness. That would take more time and tangible evidence of change, but possibility. And sometimes, possibility is enough to build on. 3 months after the fateful will reading that changed everything, I stood on the construction site of what would become Whitaker Construction's most ambitious project to date, the Evergreen Community Center, a fully sustainable zero-carbon footprint complex that would showcase everything our new division could accomplish. The morning sun glinted off my hard hat as I reviewed blueprints with our project manager, the unseasonably warm spring air carrying the mingled scents of fresh earth and possibility. The living wall system will be installed next week, explained Darius Chen, the brilliant young architect I'd recruited from a competitor. The irrigation uses harvested rainwater exclusively, and the plants are all native species that support local pollinators. And the solar integration? I asked, pointing to the curved roof sections on the blueprint. Exceeding initial projections. The new panel technology is 30% more efficient than what was available when we started planning. We're actually going to generate more power than the facility requires. I nodded, satisfaction warming me more than the spring sunshine. When I'd first proposed this project, combining a community center, urban garden, educational facilities, and art spaces in one harmoniously integrated complex, the board had been skeptical. Too expensive, too experimental, too far outside our traditional market, they'd argued. But I'd persisted, leveraging every ounce of the authority my father had bequeathed me. I'd secured partnerships with environmental organizations, arts foundations, and educational institutions. I'd personally courted donors and investors who shared our vision, and most crucially, I demonstrated how this showcase project would position Whitaker Construction at the forefront of the sustainable building movement, opening doors to lucrative new markets. Now, seeing the structure taking shape, steel, beams rising against the sky, walls beginning to define spaces that would soon foster creativity and community, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Not the petty satisfaction of proving doubters wrong, but the deeper fulfillment of bringing something genuinely valuable into being. Aunt Eliza. I turned to see Casey and Cameron making their way across the site, both wearing the visitor hard hats and safety vests I'd arranged for them. Behind them, moving more cautiously in impractical shoes, came Vanessa. "Boys! Vanessa! I didn't expect you until later," I called, excusing myself from Darius and walking to meet them. The past 3 months had brought surprising shifts in family dynamics. After our confrontation regarding his financial improprieties, Richard had taken a week to consider his options, then chosen the path of accountability and restitution. He had accepted a restructured role focusing on client relationships and business development, areas where his charisma and industry connections shone without giving him direct control over financial matters. He was working with our financial team to gradually unwind the problematic arrangements he'd created, making restitution through a combination of returned funds and forfeited bonuses. Our professional relationship remained strictly formal, our interactions limited to necessary business matters conducted with careful civility. There was no pretense of forgiveness or reconciliation. The wounds were too deep, the betrayals too significant for such easy resolution. But we had achieved a functional working arrangement that preserved the company's stability while holding Richard accountable for his actions. What I hadn't anticipated was the gradual thawing of relations. With Vanessa and my nephews, it had begun with that first sustainable building tour I'd given the boys, followed by occasional text messages about their environmental science projects, then lunch meetings that expanded to include Vanessa. Small steps, tentative and fragile, building connections independent of the tension that remained between Richard and me. We finished our exams early, Casey explained, his typical teenage nonchalance failing to mask his enthusiasm. Mom said we could come see how much progress they've made since last month. Perfect timing, I replied. They're installing the first sections of the living wall system next week. I was just reviewing the plans with our lead architect. Is that the one that purifies the air inside the building? Cameron asked, his interest equally evident despite his efforts to seem casual. Exactly. It acts as a natural biofilter while also controlling temperature and humidity. I turned to include Vanessa in the conversation. The system will reduce energy costs by approximately 20% compared to traditional HVAC systems. Vanessa nodded, her initial skepticism about the project having gradually evolved into reluctant admiration as she'd seen the plans develop. The boys' environmental science teacher is using this project as a case study for their class. Apparently, you're something of a celebrity among the eco-conscious teens at Westridge Academy. I laughed, genuinely surprised. Well, that's a demographic I never expected to impress. Can we see where the solar glass is going to be installed? Casey asked. I'm doing my final project on integrated solar technologies. Absolutely. Let me show you the southern exposure where we're... My phone rang, interrupting the moment. I glanced at the screen. Charles Webb, our CFO. Sorry, I need to take this. Why don't you three head over to the site office? There's a 3D model of the completed project that might interest you. As they walked toward the trailer that served as our on-site headquarters, I answered the call. Charles, what's up? The Meridian Group just called, he said without preamble. They want to move up our presentation. Their board has an unexpected opening tomorrow afternoon, and they'd like us to fill it. I processed this quickly. The Meridian Group operated a chain of luxury hotels across the country. Securing them as clients for our new sustainable design division would be a major coup, exactly the kind of high-profile contract that would establish our credibility in this new market. Tomorrow? That's incredibly short notice. Yes, and there's more. They specifically requested that both you and Richard conduct the presentation together. Apparently, they're concerned about the leadership changes and want to see evidence of a unified direction. I sighed. Of all the complications I didn't need right now. Have you spoken to Richard about this? Not yet. I wanted to check with you first. I appreciate that. Let me think. I glanced toward the site office where Vanessa and the boys were now examining the model. An idea began to form. The Meridian Group will be there. And Charles, let's meet in my office in an hour to review the presentation materials. I'll speak with Richard myself. After ending the call, I took a moment to center myself before walking to the site office. The Meridian Group presentation was too important to risk because of personal tensions. Whatever my feelings about Richard, the company's success had to take priority. Somehow, we needed to present a unified front convincing enough to secure this contract. Inside the trailer, the boys were animatedly discussing features of the 3D model with the project coordinator, while Vanessa stood slightly apart, checking messages on her phone. I approached her directly. Vanessa, could I speak with you privately for a moment? She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before her usual composed expression returned. Of course. We stepped outside, moving a short distance from the trailer to ensure privacy. I've just received some news that affects Richard, I began. The Meridian Group, the hotel chain we've been courting for months, has moved up their presentation to tomorrow. They've specifically requested that Richard and I present together. Vanessa's eyebrows rose slightly. That's complicated. Indeed. Richard and I have maintained professional distance these past months. It's been effective for day-to-day operations, but this presentation requires something more. We need to demonstrate genuine collaboration, a shared vision for the company's direction. And you're telling me this because I could use your help. Richard respects your judgment, listens to your perspective in ways he doesn't with others. If you could convey the importance of this presentation, emphasize that it's about the company's future rather than our up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.